British Prime Minister Keir Starmer has issued a groundbreaking ultimatum that the UK will recognize a Palestinian state unless Israel makes drastic changes to its policies in Gaza and elsewhere. Well, Simon Barrett of Revelation TV joins us now from London. So, Simon, what was your reaction to this statement?
I'm horrified. Quite frankly, I'm disgusted. I'm appalled. And I'm angry because, Israel is a close ally. Israel is the only democratic ally that we have that we can trust and rely on. But unfortunately, what Keir Starmer has done by saying that he wants to recognize a Palestinian state is rewarding Hamas for the terrorism that they committed against Israelis on October the 7th. This is partly because we're seeing this Islamization under his premiership since he took power and won the general election in 2024. This government has moved from a position of the previous one in supporting Israel, being a close ally, to making Israel an enemy. And this government would sooner support Hamas and the military and political objectives of Hamas than defending the only Jewish state and the only democracy in the Middle East. And quite frankly, I feel for the future security and the spiritual health of our nation if Keir Starmer decides to go ahead and unilaterally recognize a Palestinian state, which is nothing but a reward for terrorism.
Now, this comes in the wake of France announcing a similar thing, but the UK would be, quote unquote, Israel's closest ally to make this move. Now, obviously, both you and I are very familiar with the Middle East, but for the outsider, why is this? Why is this such a big deal?
It's such a big deal, primarily because the Palestinians themselves and the Arab Palestinians, effectively what they want is a state as a means to destroying the state of Israel. This is part of the intentions belonging to Fatah, which is the leading faction of the PLO that run the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah. It's the same goals as Hamas in their covenant charter they wrote in 1987, calls for the destruction of the state of Israel, and also Jews around the world in their covenant charter. So very similar to that of Hitler's Mein Kampf that was published 100 years ago this month. So by actually sending a message, what message is this sending Hamas? This is sending a Hamas, they don't need to negotiate. They don't need to release the hostages. And if they continue their violence and terrorism against Israel, then they will be rewarded with stateship if Britain and France have their way. Now, the saving grace is that we have a president in power in Washington, D.C., that can put a stop to this. And if it wasn't for President Trump, then I think Israel would be in a very dangerous place right now. But thankfully, I think the US president has Israel's back. But sadly, Britain, who was one of Israel's closest allies in Europe, has actually betrayed Israel and the Jewish people. And what we're going to see is an escalation of terrorism in this country. But our own Jewish community is feeling very scared and very vulnerable right now. And this is just going to inflame Jew hatred against our Jewish community.
You know, on a separate, but I guess, as you pointed out, a similar note is the incredible rise of anti-Semitism in the UK and Europe. We've documented it well here on CBN News. It's terrifying. But what would your response be to the idea that Starmer is somehow using this as a pressure point to force Israel to change its policies in Gaza? Obviously, people are seeing images coming out of Gaza. There's reports of starvation. This has become more of a PR war in a lot of ways than a physical one. What would you want the average person in the UK, or even not the average person, people like the Prime Minister, people in power, what about Israel and the conflict would you want the people in your nation to know?
What I'd like our Prime Minister to know and our nation to know is looking at the Bible. And if we look at Genesis chapter 12, 1-3, that I will bless those who bless you and I will curse those who curse you. By calling and recognizing a unilateral Palestinian state, this nation will invoke a curse from the God of Israel upon our nation. It's a curse that will fall upon our Prime Minister Keir Starmer and our Foreign Secretary David Lammy. And this would put our nation on the wrong side of history. We would align ourselves with the Islamic forces that want to destroy Israel and destroy the West. And this is opening up a Pandora's box of evil that will be unprecedented in this nation's history. And there's a great danger as well that what we'll see is it will mobilize the Islamists within the Labour Party and many in this nation to realize that they are unifying under the issue of Gaza and a Palestinian state, and it will lead to an increase of Islamism and terrorism in this country. So that if our nation wants to do the right thing historically and spiritually, then we need to stand with Israel and the Jewish people at this critical time and not believe the lies of our mainstream media and that of our government, that Israel is carrying out an audacious and attempt of deliberate starvation in Gaza, when we know the problem is Hamas. The problem is the United Nations and these aid agencies are working together to prevent this aid getting to the ordinary Gazans who need it. And so therefore we're seeing a weaponization of aid. I think we are living in a time and a dystopian time where truth is a casualty of war, but our government and our mainstream media are choosing lies over truth. And that's a scary place to be.
I think it's hard for some people, especially here in the United States, to understand, I mean, really understand what Hamas is all about. And you've pointed out this idea of Islamization. You know, we've documented things, you know, in Congo, in Nigeria, obviously in Syria, where there's these, you know, the actual genocide, actual, you know, people being hacked to death and just really awful things in the name of this Islamization. But it seems kind of distant here in the United States. Now, the reports we're seeing, you know, that some of this stuff is starting to come to European shores. Maybe you guys are a few decades ahead of us. What exactly do you mean by that?
Essentially, what I mean is what we're seeing in this nation is something called the Red-Green Alliance. This is the hard left aligning themselves with Islamists to bring down and destroy our Judeo-Christian heritage. And this is exactly what we're seeing being played out with this Labour government under Keir Starmer. He's of the hard left. He's aligning himself with the Islamists because he wants to destroy our nation, our Judeo-Christian heritage. But the danger in doing so and following along with the kind of globalist agenda, very much like the Biden administration and the policies that he pursued when he was president, is that the Islamists will use this as a means of getting power and influence. And so therefore to implement Sharia law, to change British foreign policy, which has already happened to a pro-Islamist terrorist strategy. And we're seeing this come out of our own government, sadly, and effectively means that our cherished freedoms and values that we hold in the West, particularly in Britain, where we stood alone over 85 years ago against the Nazi threat. We were the only nation standing up to Hitler. And again, what we are seeing from our own Prime Minister is a complete surrender to this Islamist agenda of terror organizations like Hamas and their influence by the Qataris that have huge influence over our economic policies and also our government policies. So, yeah, we're living in dark and dangerous times, and it's time as your American audience to see what's happening in Europe and to say we need to wake up because we pose an existential threat as well as the massive problem we have with our migrant crisis. Illegal immigration into this country is changing the whole nature of our society, our culture, and our nation. And it poses an existential threat. And of course, this increases the Islamization of our nation as well. You only have to go to a place called Molenbeek in just outside of Brussels in Belgium. And you realize when you visit that place that this is the epicenter of political Islam because it's shifted from the Middle East and it's come to Europe. And if our European leaders, including our own government, don't stand up to this threat and don't stand with Israel and the Jewish people, then dangerous days lie ahead.
Simon Barrett, I appreciate your time and your perspective, my friend. God bless.
God bless. Thank you so much.